The offer was $114,000, and it came from the same man who once called the whole thing a junkyard waiting to happen. Nobody in Gideon's neighborhood thought twice about the pipes. When Hartwell Fabrication shut down their secondary plant on the east side of Dillard, Mississippi back in the early 2000s, they left behind a gravel lot, a rusted chain-link fence, and years' worth of scrap metal they simply didn't want to haul away. Copper tubing, steel rods, aluminum sheets warped at the edges, cast iron fittings still threaded but too old to resell. The company arranged for a salvage crew to take most of it, but the stuff that wasn't worth their time, the bent, the broken, the too small to bother, they stacked along the back edge of their property line, which happened to be the same fence that ran along the side yard of a small blue house on Tanner Street. That house belonged to Loretta Voss, and Loretta Voss was the grandmother of a boy named Calvin Reese. Calvin was 11 when Hartwell shut down, old enough to notice the metal appearing in piles, too young to understand what any of it was worth. He'd stand at the fence after school and just look at it, the way the afternoon sun caught a coil of copper and turned it orange gold, the way rain left rust streaks down the side of a steel plate like something bleeding slow. There was something about the shapes of the discarded things that interested him, not in a precious way, not like he was an artist or anything like that. Just, he'd stand there and look the way some kids stare at clouds or construction sites, trying to figure out what things were before they got left behind. His grandmother didn't mind the pile at first. It was on Hartwell's side of the fence, not hers. But over the years, as the company fully abandoned the lot and the city took over the land without ever cleaning it up, the line between Hartwell's property and Loretta's blurred. Especially during heavy rain, when metal would shift and smaller pieces would end up in her yard. She called the city twice. Someone came out, took a look, wrote something on a clipboard, and nothing ever happened. So Calvin started moving the pieces that landed in the yard himself. He'd stack them by the back porch. His grandmother told him to just throw them in the trash, but he didn't. He couldn't say exactly why. He just didn't. By the time he was 13, he had a collection. Not organized, not planned. Just a pile that grew by whatever drifted over the fence or whatever he could pull through the gaps in the chain link when the pieces were small enough. An old neighbor named Henry Stroud, who used to work at a machine shop before his knees gave out, sat on the back steps one afternoon and watched Calvin try to figure out how a copper elbow fitting connected to a straight pipe. "You want to know how that works?" Henry said. Calvin looked up. Yeah, that was the beginning of something neither of them could have named at the time. Henry Stroud was not a patient man by nature. He'd spent 30 years in a shop where things either fit or they didn't, where tolerances were measured in thousandths of an inch, and where nobody had time to explain what they were doing because everyone was assumed to already know. But something about the way Calvin held those fittings, turning them over slowly, studying the threads, made Henry stop and sit down on those back steps more than once. He taught Calvin the basics over 2 summers, how copper sweats when you heat it with a torch, and how solder flows toward the heat. How steel work hardens if you bend it too many times in the same place. How aluminum is light but it fatigues. How cast iron doesn't forgive mistakes the way softer metals do. He taught him the difference between a fitting that was meant to carry water and one meant to carry gas, and why that distinction mattered more than most people thought. Calvin absorbed it the way kids absorb things they actually care about. Not like studying, more like eating. He wasn't writing it down. He was just taking it in. By the time Calvin was 15, he was doing small repairs for neighbors, a leaking pipe under Mrs. Calloway's kitchen sink, a gas line connection at the brewer house that wasn't quite seated right. Henry Stroud supervised for a while, then stopped supervising because he didn't need to anymore. Calvin charged almost nothing. Sometimes just a meal. His grandmother asked him once why he didn't charge more, and he said he was still learning, so it didn't feel right to charge full price. Loretta Voss had raised Calvin since he was 4 years old after his mother left for Memphis, and his father was, well, his father was somewhere, but not here. She'd worked 23 years as a dietary aide at Mercy General before her hip replacement. She knew the value of showing up and doing what you said you were going to do, and she recognized it in her grandson, even if the world around them didn't see much worth celebrating on Tanner Street. The metal kept coming. Not in dramatic quantities. Hartwell's lot wasn't magically regenerating. But the city's neglect meant that the lot became an informal dumping ground over the years. People dropped scrap, contractors left materials after jobs. Calvin learned to identify what was valuable and what wasn't. He started sorting. Copper in one stack, steel in another, aluminum stacked flat so it didn't warp further, cast iron pieces grouped by size. His cousin Dante visited one summer and stood in the backyard looking at the organized stacks with the expression of someone who has just discovered a relative is strange in a way they hadn't accounted for. "What are you going to do with all this?" Dante asked. Calvin said, "I don't know yet." Dante laughed, not meanly, but in the way you laugh at something that doesn't make obvious sense. He went back inside to watch TV. Calvin went back to sorting. High school was unremarkable for Calvin in the way that high school is unremarkable for a lot of kids who don't fit neatly into any of its social architectures. He wasn't an athlete. He wasn't a troublemaker. He got decent grades in the classes he liked. Shop, obviously, and also geometry, which made a different kind of sense to him once he started thinking about angles in fabrication. He had a small group of friends, none of them particularly interested in what he was doing in his grandmother's backyard. He learned to weld at 17 from a YouTube channel run by a retired ironworker in Louisiana. He watched the same videos 40-50 times. He bought a flux core welder with money he'd saved from odd jobs, carried it home on the bus in a box that was too big to fit in the overhead area, and spent 3 weeks burning through scrap practice pieces in the backyard before his grandmother leaned out the window and told him to stop with the sparks because she was trying to watch her programs. He got better. He got a lot better. The first thing he made that wasn't a repair or a practice piece was a gate. The fence between the backyard and the alley had a gap where the old gate had rusted off its hinges years ago, and Loretta had been after the landlord about it for 2 years without result. Calvin welded a new gate out of steel rod stock, and a piece of flat bar he straightened out with a vise and a lot of patience. He hung it himself, shimmed it level, and welded the hinge plates to the fence post. Loretta stood at the kitchen window watching him. When he swung the gate open and it moved clean on its axis without dragging, she just nodded and went back to whatever she'd been doing. That was the only review he needed. He graduated high school in 2018 without much fanfare and without a plan that would have satisfied any career counselor. No college applications, no job lined up. His grandmother didn't push, which said something about her trust in him, but there were nights. Calvin could feel it, even if she never said it, when she lay awake wondering what was going to happen to this boy she'd raised, this boy with the pile of metal in the backyard and the welding helmet hanging on the porch post. He got a job at an auto shop on Clement Avenue doing oil changes and tire rotations. It paid enough to keep him going. He spent his evenings in the backyard. What he was building by this point wasn't entirely clear even to him. He'd started making things. Small things first. Brackets, hooks, simple shelving frames. Then a garden trellis for Loretta out of copper pipe and bent rod that she didn't ask for but put up anyway because it was actually beautiful in a way she hadn't expected. Then a floor lamp for his own room, fabricated from a length of black iron pipe and a cast iron base he machined down with a borrowed grinder. He took a photo of it, and his friend Reese said it looked like something out of a magazine. Calvin didn't know what to do with that information. He started selling things, not intentionally at first. A woman named Dale Coburn, no relation to the Coburn family in his grandmother's church, different people entirely, saw the trellis in Loretta's backyard over the fence and knocked on the door to ask where it came from. Loretta told her Calvin made it. Dale Coburn asked if he could make her one. He said he could. She asked what it would cost. He told her material costs plus his time, which came to $65, and Dale Coburn laughed like he'd made a joke. "Honey," she said, "I'd pay 3 times that." He charged her $65 anyway. He wasn't sure he trusted the math yet, but he started paying attention. He made a simple pipe shelf bracket, The kind that was showing up in renovated houses all over the country in that particular moment when people started wanting their new construction to look like it was 100 years old, and put a photo of it on a selling platform online. It sold in 4 days. He made 2 more. They sold. He made a dozen. They all sold. He was not a businessman. He was not a marketer. He had no aesthetic education and no design vocabulary. What he had was an eye. An eye he developed over years of standing at a fence looking at metal and figuring out what things were before they got left behind. He knew instinctively what looked right. He knew when a weld was clean enough to be part of the design instead of something to hide. He knew how to work with the surface of old metal instead of against it. By 2020, he was making more from selling fabricated pieces on weekends than he was making at the auto shop. He quit the auto shop in October of that year. His grandmother didn't say anything about it for a week, and then one morning she put a plate of eggs in front of him and said, "You better know what you're doing." He said, "Yes, ma'am." He didn't fully know what he was doing, but he knew the direction. The business grew the way small businesses grow when they're built on actual craft rather than pitch decks and venture money. Slowly. Then less slowly. He built a website with help from a woman he met at a local maker market named Giselle Harmon, who did graphic design on the side and charged him far less than she should have because she thought the work was worth helping. Started getting custom orders. A restaurant downtown wanted iron pendant lamp housings. An interior designer in Jackson needed custom curtain rod hardware for a client's historic home renovation. A man in Memphis wanted a pair of gates for his driveway fabricated from reclaimed steel. Calvin Reese said yes to all of it. He started hiring. First just his friend Tyrese, who had more time than work and turned out to be a quick study with a grinder. Then a young woman named Priya. No last name necessary, she just went by Priya at the shop, who had studied mechanical engineering for 2 years before she ran out of money and was looking for somewhere to use her hands. Calvin paid her fairly and gave her problems to solve that her partial engineering degree had actually prepared her for, and she stayed. The backyard on Tanner Street had long since become inadequate. By 2021, Calvin was renting a bay at a shared workshop space on the industrial side of Dillard. He kept the organized piles of metal in Loretta's backyard because he kept using what was there. The copper especially had value he'd never exhausted, but the production work happened in the bay. The space smelled like other people's projects as well as his own, and he liked that. He liked being around people who were making things. He expanded the product line, furniture, seating with welded steel frames and salvaged wood tops. Outdoor pieces, fire pit rings, arbors, decorative fencing sections. A line of smaller items that could be sold through boutiques, cabinet hardware, hooks, bookends, made in batches and sold wholesale. In 2022, a small profile of his business ran in a regional magazine. A woman named Talia Reeves. No, wait, that name was taken from somewhere else. A woman named Sandra Marsh, an editor at the publication, had driven past his workshop space and noticed the pieces out front that he used as display and signage. She asked if she could write something. He said, fine. The piece ran under the headline, "From the Fence Line," how one man turned Hartwell's leftovers into a living, and contained a detail about the origin of his materials, the scrap from the abandoned Hartwell lot, that he had mentioned almost in passing, but that ended up being the emotional center of the story as Sandra Marsh wrote it. He hadn't thought of it as a story. To him, it was just where the metal came from. The response to the article surprised him. He got orders from 6 states. He got an inquiry from a design studio in Atlanta. He got a voicemail from a man named Garrett Hale, who identified himself as a property developer and said he wanted to talk. Calvin returned that call about 3 weeks later, which was how long it took for things to slow down enough that he felt he could have a conversation that wasn't rushed. He met Garrett Hale at a coffee shop on the better side of Dillard and listened while Hale talked about a mixed-use development he was building. Boutique apartments on top, retail and restaurant below. And his desire, or his investor's desire, for the space to have character, by which he meant things that looked handmade and old and local when they were in fact new, but made to feel otherwise. What he wanted, specifically, was custom metalwork throughout the public areas of the building. Stair railings, light fixtures, entry gates, lobby hardware, exterior signage frames. He had a designer's vision. He needed someone who could execute it in metal. He wanted it from Calvin. The number he quoted, after some back and forth that took 3 separate meetings, was $114,000. Calvin sat with that number for a moment, not because he didn't trust it, not because he thought it was wrong, just because there was something that needed a second to settle when a number like that was said out loud in connection to what had started as a pile of pipe fittings over a chain-link fence. "That's for the full scope?" Calvin asked. "Full scope," Garrett Hale said. "Materials and labor included. We pay in 3 installments, deposit at signing, progress at rough completion, balance at final inspection." Calvin nodded. "I'll need to bring on one more fabricator for the railings. And the timeline you're looking at is aggressive. What do you need?" 12 weeks, and an additional installer on your end for the final hanging. My team handles fabrication and delivery. Your contractor handles the mounting work." Hale looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Done." What Calvin didn't say in that meeting, because it wasn't Garrett Hale's business and also because Calvin was not given to speeches, was that Garrett Hale's development was being built 3 blocks from Tanner Street, that the building, when completed, would be the nicest structure in that part of Dillard, that the railings and the light fixtures and the entry gates would be made in significant part from the copper and steel that had come over that fence line over the course of 15 years, material that a factory had written off and a city had forgotten, and a boy had picked up and sorted and studied and learned, piece by piece, until he understood it well enough to make something permanent out of it. He also didn't say that his grandmother would be able to see the building from the end of Tanner Street if she stood at the right angle. He didn't say any of that. He said, "I'll have the contract back to you by Friday," and Garrett Hale shook his hand, and that was that. The work took 14 weeks, not 12. 2 more than Calvin had promised, which ate into his margin in a way that was uncomfortable but not catastrophic. A shipment of reclaimed oak for the stair treads. His design had the railings paired with wood, which wasn't strictly part of his scope, but which he'd incorporated anyway because it looked better. Arrived badly warped and had to be resourced. Tyrese had a family situation in week 9 that took him out for 10 days. Priya held the shop together during that stretch, with a focus that made Calvin reconsider what he was paying her. He raised her pay before the project was done, without being asked. It seemed like the right thing to do, and he did it. The final installation happened on a cold Thursday morning in January. Calvin stood in the lobby of the building and watched the mounting crew hang the last of the pendant fixtures. Copper pipe and cast iron. A simple design that was somehow exactly right for the space. And he felt something he didn't have a clean word for. Not pride exactly, more like completion, like a circle closing. His grandmother came to see it the following Saturday. He drove her over and walked her through. She moved slowly. The hip was still a factor, always would be, and she touched the stair railing as she went up, running her fingers along the steel. "You made this," she said. It wasn't a question. "I made it," he said. She didn't say anything else for a while. They stood in the lobby and looked at the fixtures, the hardware, the entry gate that Calvin had designed to echo, without ever explaining why, because nobody asked, the look of an old industrial fence line, a chain-link memory rendered in hand-bent steel rod, a nod to where things began. Loretta Voss put her hand on her grandson's arm. "Your mama should see this," she said. Calvin said, "Maybe." He was 24 years old. Garrett Hale's building won a regional design award the following year. The write-up mentioned the custom metalwork. It didn't mention Calvin Reese by name in the headline, but it mentioned his shop, Tanner Metalworks, which was what he'd eventually named it, for reasons he never had to explain to his grandmother, in the second paragraph. Several people who read the write-up placed orders. A design firm in Nashville called about a hospitality project. A historic preservation society in New Orleans reached out about reproduction hardware for a renovation on a building from the 1880s. Calvin hired 2 more people. He moved out of the shared workshop and into his own space. a former machine shop on Delacroix Street that needed work but had the right bones. He spent the first month there renovating it himself, in his off hours, the way he'd always learned things, by doing them with his own hands before he asked anyone else to do them. The Hartwell lot on the east side of Dillard eventually got cleared by the city as part of a blight remediation effort. By the time the crew came through with their equipment, there wasn't much left, anyway. Calvin had worked through most of the usable material over the years. What the remediation crew found was a mostly empty lot with some concrete rubble and a length of old fence that didn't belong to anyone. The fence on Loretta's side of the property was still standing. Calvin had repaired it himself twice. New posts where the old ones had rotted, new chain link where it had come apart. It was still there, straight and solid and well maintained. On one of the fence posts, barely visible unless you were looking for it, there was a mark from a bead of weld that Calvin had never fully ground down, a small raised knob of steel, oxidized dark brown, the trace of the very first weld he'd run in the backyard. A practice bead on a post he'd treated as scrap material before he understood what scrap material could become. He'd thought about grinding it smooth 100 times. He never did. Some things you leave where they are, so you know where you started.